My name wasn't in the will. That's what they told me the morning after my mother's funeral. While the lasagna was still warm in the kitchen and her perfume hadn't yet faded from the guest bedroom sheets. You know, Aunt Lorraine said, folding her arms like she was bracing for a slap. Your mom rewrote it a few months ago. She left everything to Mark and the twins. Mark, my ex-husband, and those twins, they weren't mine. They were his from his first marriage. I raised them like they were mine because he said family wasn't about blood, it was about loyalty. I sat there on the couch, hands clasped in my lap, pulse thudding in my ears. My son Daniel was playing with Legos in the corner, oblivious. My jaw locked, my breath didn't come. Not until the laughter from the kitchen started up again. The rest of them had moved on already. Moved on from her, from me. I didn't cry, not when they poured wine and made jokes about how your mom always meant well. Not when Lorraine patted my shoulder and whispered, "You've still got Daniel." That's all that matters now, right? No, what mattered was this. They lied. Because I had sat with my mother just 6 weeks before she died. I brought her warm soup and clipped her nails and brushed her silver hair back as she spoke in a rasp that made my throat close. I updated the will, she said. You'll be protected now, just like we planned. She never would have given Mark control of a single penny. Not after what he did. Not after the bruises I tried to hide. Not after he cheated while I was pregnant, then tried to gaslight me into thinking I was too emotional. So if her will said otherwise, someone changed it. And they counted on me being too broken, too tired, or too polite to notice, but they miscalculated because I was already halfway to numb. And when you're numb, you stop begging people to see the truth. You start gathering evidence. I left early that evening. I loaded Daniel into the back seat, strapped him in tight, and drove home. In silence. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and sat there staring at the mailbox, thought the world hadn't changed. But something inside me had. I got Daniel into bed and sat on the living room floor with my back to the couch. There was an unopened envelope on the table. Sympathy card, probably from someone who didn't show up. I didn't open it. Instead, I opened the drawer where I kept the thumb drive, the one labeled for after. My mother had given it to me a month ago. You'll know when it's time, she said. I'd thought she was being dramatic. She always had a flair for mystery. But now, the clock had started ticking. I plugged it into my laptop. The file opened slowly, like even the pixels were hesitant. There were PDFs, medical directives, power of attorney docs, a scanned copy of her updated will with my full name clearly listed as sole executor and beneficiary, but the most important file, a letter, in her handwriting, scanned on hospice stationery. If you're reading this, then something is wrong. If the will is not what we agreed, I want you to fight. They will try to say you're grieving, that you're confused. Don't believe them. I trust you to do what I couldn't. Finish this. I didn't sleep that night. I poured a glass of wine, then pushed it aside. I needed my mind clear. I made a list, every name of everyone who'd had access to her in the last few months. Every nurse, every notary, every family member, every login she might have used. Then I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it War.it. Wasn't rage. Rage is loud, sloppy, temporary. This was precision. Cold, slow. I was done waiting to be told what was fair. They wanted me to be a grieving daughter with a soft heart and no fight left. But I'd been surviving since the day Mark slammed the door in my face and left me with a toddler, a mortgage, and a stack of legal threats. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was waking up. The first thing I did the next morning was call the lawyer, listed on my mother's scanned will, the real one. His name was William Pike, a state attorney in a small town 2 hours north. I told him who I was, and there was a pause on the line. Not confusion, hesitation. I thought the family went with another firm. He said finally. They did, I replied, but I have a copy of a signed will from your office, dated 6 months ago, with my name on it. Another pause. Then he exhaled. Come in. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I dropped Daniel off at school and drove the 2 hours in silence. The highway was long and flat, just rows of telephone poles and wheat fields. I thought of all the times I'd driven that road to visit my mother in the hospital, playing her favorite music just loud enough to drown out my own thoughts. She liked Fleetwood Mac. I liked the silence. When I walked into Pike's office, he stood up right away. Older man, stiff posture, eyes like polished stones. He asked to see the file. I handed over the thumb drive. He clicked, skimmed, nodded slowly. She had this signed in my office. Witnessed, notarized, filed, and scanned into our system. Then why wasn't it submitted for probate? I asked. He looked uncomfortable. Your cousin Mark called shortly after your mother's passing. Said she'd changed her mind. Said there was a new will drawn up and that I should stay out of it unless I wanted trouble. I tried to confirm with your mother's hospice nurse, but she was suddenly unavailable. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Speaky. He scared you off. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "Do you want to contest the submitted will?" I leaned forward, hands folded. "I want to bury it." He looked impressed. He gave me copies of everything. Originals too, in case it ever went to court. I left with a file box, a fire in my spine, and a singular goal: destroy the forgery, expose the lie, and take back what was mine. But I wasn't going to walk into court unarmed. I needed leverage. And leverage is born from secrets. So I started with Mark. Back home. I opened a new document titled His Patterns. I remembered how he used to write checks from our joint account and cash them at strange hours. How he always seemed to know when money was coming in from my freelance contracts before I told him. I remembered when he suddenly had a second phone for work, he claimed. I remembered the phone calls with the door closed, the 6-day fishing trips that didn't smell like fish when he got home. I had access to him once, and now I was going to use that memory like a knife. I logged into an old Gmail account I used. 2 years before he asked me to just use the shared one. It's easier. It was still active, still had receipts, subscriptions, password reset links. I spent 2 days combing through it, piecing together where money had gone, who he'd stayed with, what hotels had his name. Then I made another list: names he used, credit cards he hid, properties listed under his LLC. That last one hit hard. He had bought a second home 3 years before our divorce, used a business entity, had it titled in a trust, probably planned to move in with his new woman when I finally broke. But guess what? He never dissolved that LLC, never removed me as registered agent. It was still traceable, still usable. He built it thinking I'd never look. He was wrong. In the evenings, I played board games with Daniel, tucked him in, read him books like everything was normal. He'd look up at me sometimes and say, "You look tired, Mommy." I'd smile and kiss his forehead. Just thinking a lot, sweetheart, because he didn't need to know what I was building. He just needed to feel safe. At night, I went back to the thumb drive. I compared signatures. My mother's real one, smooth and slanted, like her. The one on the forged will, clumsy, nervous. I printed them side by side. I circled the trembling R in her last name, and then I found it. A record of a notary stamp used at a pharmacy in town. The date of the forged will. But the pharmacist who used to work there, she died last year. Dead people don't notarize documents. I sat back and smiled for the first time in weeks, because now I had them. The trick about betrayal is that it doesn't stop after the first blow. It echoes quietly through every small silence that follows. And in the days after I uncovered the forged signature and the dead notary, the echoes got louder. Mark started texting again. "I know you're still hurting. We should talk. Don't let grief poison your judgment." Lorraine said, "You've been snooping around. It's not healthy." That last one told me everything. They were watching me, which meant I had to stop reacting and start controlling the narrative. I didn't reply. Instead, I created a new email. Clean, unlinked, no name, no signature. Then I emailed a digital forensic expert, someone I found through a legal subreddit for estate fraud victims. His name was Trent, former cybersecurity analyst. Now, he specialized in verifying or disproving digital documents in probate disputes. I sent him the scanned will with the shaky signature and the time-stamped metadata. 3 hours later, he replied, "Based on metadata inconsistencies, the file appears to have been scanned after your mother's death with retroactive date stamps embedded via PDF manipulation. I can issue a sworn statement." I asked how strong that would hold up in court. Strong enough to crack it open, especially when paired with the dead notary and handwriting comparison. I thanked him, wired his fee, and added his affidavit to my war folder. The next day, I went to the courthouse, not to file. Not yet. I needed to watch. I sat in the probate hearing for a different family. 2 sons arguing over a fishing cabin. Voices rising. Emotions everywhere. The judge looked tired. But what I was studying wasn't the case, it was the rhythm of the courtroom. How objections were phrased, how evidence had to be introduced, how emotions helped or backfired. I walked out with clarity. This wasn't about who felt wronged. It was about who proved the lie. And I was gathering truth like shrapnel. That night, I called my mom's hospice nurse, real name Diana. I found her through her old employer, now working at a private home care agency. I introduced myself. She hesitated, then said, I was wondering when you'd call. I held my breath. She told me to expect someone would try something. She didn't trust them. Who? Your ex? The aunt? Even the son-in-law? She said they always smiled too fast when you left the room. Diana agreed to meet. She brought her own copy of notes, patient directives, conversations logged, even a voice memo where my mother said, Lorraine keeps asking about my will. I've told her it's handled. I nearly cried. Instead, I handed her a pen and a prepared affidavit template. She read it carefully, then signed 3 notarized statements. 3 nails in the coffin. And still, I waited, because I knew Lorraine would push again, and she did. A week later, I got a letter from her lawyer demanding I stop harassing the family and refrain from contact with estate-related professionals. Cease and desist. Laughable. So I responded the only way I knew how. I filed a formal petition to contest will with all supporting evidence attached. Then I called Pike and let him know it was filed. Then I did one last thing. I texted Mark. I read the will. The real one, the one where my name is spelled correctly and the notary wasn't 6 feet under. You lose. No reply. But I knew what would happen next. Panic, denial, and then damage control. Which meant I had to be ready for the next stage. Social isolation. Because if you can't discredit the facts, you try to discredit the person. The next morning, my boss, a quiet, fair woman named Sharon at the real estate office, called me in. I got a strange call. She said, from someone claiming you're unstable. Said you've been harassing family, even implying financial misconduct. I smiled. Let me guess. They wouldn't give a name. She nodded. Let me be clear, I said. My mother was manipulated. Before she died, I'm contesting a fraudulent will. And they're scared. Sharon looked at me for a long time, then said, good, because I didn't believe them. But I figured you should know the war's not staying private. She handed me back my appointment calendar. You're still closing next week's deal, right? I smiled for real this time. Oh, I'm closing a lot more than that. And I walked out, heels clicking like a countdown. The phone rang at 2:13 a.m., not the house phone, not my cell. It was the emergency line I'd bought prepaid, the one listed on the legal documents I'd filed. Only 3 people had the number. My attorney, the court clerk, and the person I was hoping would panic first. I answered without speaking. There was a pause. Then Mark's voice, low and brittle. We can make this go away. I didn't respond. You don't want to drag this through court, he continued. It'll get messy. Bad for Daniel. Bad for business. That last word, business, was telling. Because he didn't care about Daniel. Never did. He cared about the rentals in Florida, the cabin in Michigan, the commercial property tied to my mother's trust. The assets he'd assumed were his. I stayed quiet. Look, he said, voice softening into the tone he used to use when he wanted something. You win a little, I win a little. We walk away clean. I hung up. The next day, a subpoena was issued for all property transfers made by the family trust in the last 18 months. I'd filed it through my attorney, now fully on board. A woman named Grace Mendoza. Brilliant, surgical, and utterly unimpressed by liars. She was the type who wore clean lines and sharp heels, and called Mark Mr. Financially Creative in court filings. She loved my case. That cabin in Michigan, she said, flipping through the asset report. Your mom never even visited it, but somehow it was transferred to an LLC registered under your ex-husband's name 3 weeks before her death. I nodded. He didn't even bother hiding it. We'll take it back, she said, with interest. We filed motions, froze assets. The court ordered all contested properties to be held in a neutral trust until the case was resolved. That same day, Lorraine posted a Facebook status. Some people don't know how to let go. Grief doesn't give you permission to destroy family. I didn't reply. I just took a screenshot and sent it to Grace. Useful, she said. If they keep trying to sway public opinion, we can build harassment into our account. By the end of that week, the quiet implosion had started. A neighbor crossed the street to avoid me at the grocery store. My cousin unfollowed me. Mark's new girlfriend, a woman named Kayla, 15 years younger, who once babysat for my son, started posting thinly veiled quotes on Instagram about jealous exes and people who can't move on. I stayed silent, but I made sure Grace saw every single one. Because silence isn't weakness. It's strategy, and they mistook mine for surrender. What they didn't know, I'd requested Daniel's medical records from the past 3 years. And buried inside was a consent form signed by Mark stating he had sole custody. He never did. It was a lie submitted to a clinic receptionist when Daniel broke his wrist at age 6. At the time, we were in the middle of our divorce. He told me he'd take him for the checkup while I filed paperwork. I trusted him now. That form was legal. Dynamite. We subpoenaed the clinic. It was enough to demonstrate a pattern of forged authority, paired with the fake will. It created a character profile that screamed fraud. Mark was unraveling. The morning of our preliminary hearing, he didn't show. His lawyer did late, sweating alone. Mr. Hastings is unavailable, he said. Grace arched an eyebrow. Unavailable like hospitalized, or unavailable like hiding in Florida. Unavailable like not responding. The lawyer muttered. We pushed forward without him. Grace laid out everything. Forged, notary, falsified signature, manipulated PDF metadata, fraudulent property transfer, custody misrepresentation. When she finished, even the judge raised an eyebrow. We will reconvene in 10 days, he said. Mr. Hastings is advised to appear, or a bench warrant will be considered. It was the first public crack in their armor. And that night, I stood in the backyard under the porch light, watching Daniel chase fireflies. He laughed, barefoot in the grass, holding a jar. I smiled. For a moment, the war disappeared. Because that was what this was all for. Not the cabin. Not the bank account, the clarity. The air finally clearing around us. The ground being claimed beneath. My son's feet, they say people show their true selves when the mask slips. But Mark never had just one mask. He had layers: husband, father, charmer, victim, and now they were all peeling at once. 3 days after the hearing, Grace called me. His lawyer just withdrew from the case. Why? Non-payment. Mark stopped answering his calls. I didn't reply. I just looked out the window at the sun hitting the front yard and thought, finally, one less mask. But the silence didn't last. That same afternoon, Lorraine showed up on my doorstep. No call, no warning. Just the metallic scrape of her tires on my driveway and her perfume. That overwhelming gardenia scent filling the air before she even knocked. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She stood there with a purse clutched to her chest like a shield. Her lipstick was too bright, her voice too smooth. We need to talk, she said. No, Lorraine. I said, you need to listen. She blinked like I'd slapped her. You're tearing this family apart, she said. There's no family. Left a tear, she looked over my shoulder toward the hallway where Daniel's sneakers were tossed on the floor. This isn't good for him. All this tension, all this bitterness, forging wills and stealing property isn't good for him either. Her smile wavered. You think you've won because of a few affidavits and a fancy lawyer? No. I've won because the truth doesn't need me to yell. She shifted her weight, suddenly unsure of herself. For years, she'd leaned into that maternal church lady persona, all casseroles and concerned texts. But I remembered the way she whispered behind closed doors, how she told Mark he deserved someone more stable, how she once suggested I take a job at a call center to help feel useful again. She looked smaller now, maybe because I'd stopped shrinking. Walk away, Allison, she said. You have your son. You have your job. Let the rest go. I tilted my head. You ever wonder why my mom never left you anything? Why she trusted me instead? Her mouth twitched. She saw through you, I whispered. She just didn't live long enough to burn the whole rot down. Lorraine turned on her heel and left without another word. I closed the door and locked it. 3 hours later, someone slashed my tires. The security cam caught it, a tall figure in a hoodie. Not Mark, too thin. But I didn't need to know who. I sent the footage to Grace. She filed for a restraining order the same day, naming extended family affiliates and citing targeted harassment. That's when the phone calls started, unknown numbers. Silence on the other end. Sometimes breathing, sometimes the sound of a car door slamming. I bought a second camera, upgraded the locks, took Daniel to school myself every morning. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. Instead, I went to the county recorder's office and pulled every deed related to the properties in dispute. That's when I founded a third trust, hidden behind a shell company registered in Nevada, the kind designed to disappear into fog. And listed as primary beneficiary. Kayla, Mark's girlfriend, the babysitter turned partner who'd posted photos of herself on a yacht last summer, claiming it was a girls' trip. My mother never met her, never knew her name. But somehow, this woman stood to inherit the beach house my grandfather built brick by brick after the war. I scanned the deed transfer, dated 4 days after my mother's stroke, signed supposedly in front of a mobile notary at the rehab center. I called the notary's listed number. She said she'd never been to that facility in her life, never met my mother, never signed anything. That was enough. Grace updated the petition. We added a new count, conspiracy to defraud through shell entity, property laundering. The judge agreed to fast-track the hearing. 10 more days. I stood in the mirror that night, brushing my hair, watching myself without expression. My skin was pale, my eyes darker than usual. But I didn't look tired. I looked ready. And when I tucked Daniel into bed, he whispered, "Mommy, you're not scared anymore." I kissed his forehead and whispered back, "That's right." Because the moment you stop fearing their lies, they lose their power. The courthouse was colder than usual the morning of the hearing. The kind of cold that sinks into your skin. Not from the temperature, but from the weight of what's about to happen. The kind of cold that keeps your heart steady. Mark was already inside when I arrived. He looked thinner, like the lies were eating him from the inside. He wore a wrinkled gray suit and carried a file folder that I knew was mostly empty. No lawyer beside him, no Kayla, just him and his fear, trying to look calm. I didn't speak to him. I sat 2 rows behind, just far enough to watch without letting him feel my breath on his neck. Lorraine was seated across the aisle, flanked by her new attorney. Not the slick kind this time. This one looked fresh out of law school and already tired. The judge came in. The room stood, and then the testimony began. Grace started methodically. First, the digital forensic expert, Trent, took the stand. Calm, clinical. He described how metadata had been manipulated in the PDF version of the forged will. He spoke in terms the judge clearly understood. He provided diagrams, backup files, original timestamps from our server logs. The judge listened carefully, took notes. Then Diana, the hospice nurse. She held the court's attention like a seasoned witness. She didn't dramatize, just told the truth. My mother's voice, her wishes, her clarity of mind in the final weeks. The notary never visiting. The tension around the family in her last days. Then came the notary from the Nevada property. Her tone was clipped. No, I never met the decedent. No, I never notarized any documents for the trust listed. Yes, my seal was reported stolen a month. After the alleged signing, Grace moved through the witnesses like a surgeon. No wasted words, no theatrics. Mark tried to object once. The judge silenced him. You'll have your turn. He never took it. When the time came, he stood, shuffled a few papers, and muttered something about family tensions and misunderstandings. Grace didn't even bother cross-examining him because the damage was already done. We broke for lunch in the hallway. Mark tried to approach me. Alice and I raised my hand. Don't, you're going to ruin everything. No, going to restore it. He exhaled hard, like he couldn't believe I wasn't folding. Like I was supposed to still be that woman. He left sobbing on the floor 8 years ago, but I wasn't that woman anymore. I walked past him without a word. When court resumed, Grace gave her closing argument. It was quiet, precise. She reminded the judge of the timeline, the contradictions, the forensic evidence, the repeated fraud. Then she ended with this. This isn't about money. It's about intent. A woman near death was manipulated, silenced, and overwritten. But she left behind a daughter who didn't stay silent. And today, we ask that truth be restored. The courtroom fell still. Mark didn't speak again. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. He said he'd deliberate for a week. We stood, gathered our things, outside the courthouse. The sky had turned gray. A storm was coming. Grace turned to me. This next week. Keep quiet. Let them squirm. I nodded, as we walked to our cars. Lorraine passed by with her attorney. She didn't look at me, but her lawyer did. That deer-in-headlights look. He knew he'd been handed a poisoned case. At home. That night, I tucked Daniel in and sat beside him a little longer than usual. He asked if we could go to the lake house. Again, someday, the one with the dock and the old canoe. I smiled. We will, because I already knew, even before the ruling, that I'd won more than just a case. I'd reclaimed the silence they tried to fill with lies. The ruling came on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the hearing. I was pouring cereal for Daniel when the email landed. Subject line, probate case no. 593, a final judgment. My hands didn't shake. I opened it and read. Every fraudulent document voided. All disputed properties returned to the estate. Custody of Daniel affirmed. With a footnote about prior unauthorized actions taken by the father. And most importantly, the will signed 6 months before my mother's death. The real one officially reinstated. I stood at the kitchen counter, blinking. Not from disbelief, but from the sheer stillness of it, like the air had finally cleared after a long storm. Daniel looked up at me with milk on his chin. "Mom, we're okay," I said. "We're really okay now." I sent the judgment to Grace. She replied almost instantly. "They can appeal, but it's over. I'll file the estate transition documents today." I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I did neither. Instead, I picked up my keys and drove, not to Mark's, not to the courthouse, to the courthouse. I drove to my mother's grave. The grass was still fresh, the stones simple. "Margaret Hale, beloved," I knelt down and placed a hand on the cool granite. "They tried, Mom," I whispered, but I didn't let them. A breeze rustled the trees overhead, no voice, no sign, just silence. But it was enough. Back home, I began the process of reclaiming everything. The Michigan cabin, mine again. I called a locksmith. The beach house, transferred back into the trust. I contacted a property manager and scheduled a cleanup. Kayla had trashed it, apparently. Wine stains on the carpet, cigarette burns on the wood counter. Typical. I had it all professionally restored. Not for her, for me, for Daniel. For the future, we were going to build in a space not ruined by secrets. Lorraine went silent after the ruling. Her Facebook page deactivated. Her phone line disconnected. But I wasn't done yet, because in one of the trust's old folders, I found something unexpected. A letter, unopened, addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. I sat on the porch that evening and read it while the sun sank low. "My Allison, if you're reading this, then you fought harder than anyone expected. I knew you would. I hope the lies didn't break you. I hope they sharpened you. I wanted to give you more than property or money. I wanted to give you the chance to know you were right, that you weren't crazy, that you were always the strong one. I just wish I'd told you sooner. Take the houses, the land, sell them if you want, but keep the lake cabin. That place is yours and Daniel's. That's where we were most ourselves. I love you." Mom, I folded the letter and held it to my chest. It wasn't just validation, it was release. That weekend, Daniel and I drove to the lake. We brought groceries, fishing poles, and nothing else. I watched him run down the dock, barefoot and free. At night, we lit a fire. I showed him how to roast marshmallows just the way Mom taught me. Low flame, slow turn, golden edges. He looked up at me. "You're happy again," he said. "Not happy," I said. "Hold," because I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I had delivered it, and now I was living in the quiet. She left behind a quiet that no longer hurt. I expected peace to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like precision. There were still papers to sign, assets to catalog, letters to send. But for the first time, every action I took came from a place of choice. Not survival. Grace and I met at her office the following Monday to finalize the trust's restructuring. She slid over the final forms: deed transfers, estate settlement, banking access. "I recommend you place the properties into a new trust under your control," she said. "Keeps them out of reach if they try anything again." I nodded. The new trust name, the Hale Future Fund. Not because I wanted to sound important, but because the past was finished and I was done living in it. We filed everything that afternoon. Then I walked down the courthouse hall alone and entered the clerk's office. I submitted a formal report requesting investigation into the fraudulent notary filings and forged signatures tied to the original will submission. "Are you pressing charges?" the clerk asked. I looked her straight in the eye. Yes. Mark and Lorraine thought they'd walk away quietly. They were wrong. A week later, I got a call from a county investigator. She asked for all documentation. I gave her everything. The PDF analysis, the notary's statement, the shell company records, even the voicemail Lorraine left 6 months ago saying, "We'll make sure everything stays in the family." That voicemail, timestamped the day before the forged will was filed. Game set match. I didn't ask for their arrest. I asked for the truth to finish what it started. In the meantime, I focused on rebuilding the life they tried to erase. Daniel and I began visiting the lake cabin every other weekend. I replaced the dock lights, cleaned the gutters, repainted the bedrooms. In one of the closets, I found a photo album my mom must have stashed years ago. Pictures of the fallout came quiet, no explosions, no public apologies. Just a slow unraveling. A week after the judgment, Mark's bank accounts were frozen. Not because I asked for it, but because the court flagged the unauthorized transfers tied to my mother's trust. He tried to fight it, filed a motion to reclaim his share. It was denied. Then came the foreclosure notice on his downtown condo. followed by a lien on the Florida rental property, the one he listed as a business expense. Under the shell company that no longer existed, Grace forwarded me the filings, each more desperate than the last. Ignore him, she advised. He's spiraling. Let the system do its work now. But it wasn't just about legal losses anymore. His reputation was bleeding out. The real estate agency he'd once bragged about coning dropped his name from all marketing. Clients stopped calling. I heard through a colleague that Kayla had packed up and took his car, his laptop, and apparently his last shred of pride. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to, because the punishment wasn't mine to deliver. It was already written into every lie he'd told, every paper he forged, every smirk he'd worn when he thought I was too weak to matter. Meanwhile, Daniel and I built new routines. Pancakes on Sunday, homework at the dining table instead of the couch. No more whispers behind closed doors. More money mysteries. Dishonesty. Real silence. Safe silence. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of my mother's things, I found a photo tucked inside an old cookbook. It was her, me, and Daniel standing on the cabin dock. She had her arms around both of us, her face so peaceful. On the back, she'd written, "Teach him to be strong in the quiet. That's where real power lives." I pinned it to our fridge. 2 weeks later, Lorraine filed a motion to vacate the judgment. Grace laughed when she read it. She cited emotional duress and family pressure as reasons she signed false affidavits. Problem is, she never signed one. The motion was denied within 48 hours. Lorraine disappeared from public life, moved states, according to a cousin, sold off whatever assets she had left. For the first time in years, she couldn't use my mother's name to open doors. Mark. He stopped trying to call. No texts. No late night voicemails. Just gone. Which is exactly what I wanted. I still kept a folder, digital and paper marked final. It held every document, every ruling, every receipt of what had happened, not to hold on to the pain, but to remind myself what it took to reclaim the truth. One night, I opened it, not because I was angry, but because I was preparing to let it go. I made a backup on a USB drive, labeled it, and slid it into the fireproof lockbox beside my passport. Then, I deleted every file from my desktop. It was over. Not because they surrendered, but because I won. I didn't just take back what was stolen. I changed the story. And that was something they'd never understand. Liars don't know how to rewrite endings. Only survivors do. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air crisp and still. Daniel was asleep upstairs, the house quiet. I looked out over the yard, past the trees, and into the dark that didn't scare me anymore. They had taken their shot, but I'd kept standing. And now I was the one holding the pen. A month passed, the court orders were finalized. Deeds were reissued, the estate was transferred cleanly into my name, just as it should have been from the start. I signed the final papers on a Wednesday morning, with Grace across the table from me and a notary this time very much alive stamping each document with slow, satisfying clicks. "Congratulations," Grace said, sliding the last page across. "It's done." I nodded, but I didn't smile, because winning doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it feels like sitting in a quiet room with all the noise finally gone. I took Daniel out to dinner that night, just the two of us, in a corner booth at a family-run diner. He ordered pancakes for dinner. I led him, while he smeared syrup, into a smiley face on his plate. He looked up and said, "Are we rich now?" I laughed. "No, but we're safe. And that's worth more." The next morning, I started making real plans. Not legal plans. Life plans. I called an architect about restoring the lake cabin, not to flip it, but to preserve it. The dock needed new boards, the fireplace needed to be rebuilt. The upstairs loft was falling in. I didn't care. It was ours. I also filed paperwork to set up a small scholarship fund in my mother's name, specifically for single mothers going back to school. It was something she always wanted to do, back when she still believed in justice the easy way. And then I made one final move. I scheduled a meeting with a journalist. Her name was Camille Reyes. Local, respected, known for exposing financial abuse and quiet corruption. I told her everything. Not for revenge, not for fame, but for others like me, the women too ashamed, too overwhelmed, or too afraid to fight back when families rewrite the rules behind closed doors. I brought every document. Camille listened, took notes, and said, "People need to hear this. You're not the only one." I gave her permission to use my name, my story. My silence was no longer serving me. The article published 2 weeks later. The will they buried, one woman's fight. to expose family fraud. It didn't trend. It didn't go viral, but it reached the people it needed to. My inbox filled up with messages from strangers, women, men, children of the elderly, people who'd seen the same betrayals but never had the proof or the strength to fight back. They thanked me. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to ask for the real paperwork. Turns out my brother was lying. You saved more than just your future. You saved mine too." I didn't cry reading it, but I sat for a long time, staring at the message. Then I picked up my phone and called Grace. "Let's start a foundation," I said, "for estate fraud victims, pro bono consults, education, resources, real help." She paused, then said, "I'm in." It wasn't about keeping the war going. It was about building something stronger than what they tried to burn down. That weekend, Daniel and I returned to the cabin. He brought a sketch pad and drew every room like it was a castle. I brought my mother's old recipe book and cooked the stew she used to make when the air got cold. We lit a fire. We didn't talk about courtrooms or lawyers or lies. We just sat. Safe, solid, ourselves. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like peace. The lake froze over in December. Daniel pressed his face to the cabin window that morning, breath fogging the glass, eyes wide. "It looks like glass," he whispered. "It is," I said, coming up behind him. "Just don't try to walk on it." We laughed, but a part of me knew what he really meant. He was seeing something fragile that somehow still held strong. A reflection of what our life had become. Every morning now started with quiet. No calls from creditors, no cryptic voicemails, just birdsong, wind through pine needles, and the click of the kettle heating water. The cabin restoration was nearly done. I kept the bones of the place, the crooked shelves my grandfather built, the squeaky floorboard by the fireplace, the tree Daniel carved his name into when he was 4. But I added new things too. A long writing desk overlooking the lake. Curtains with blue and green thread like waves and leaves. A lock on the front door that only opened with my code. I'd created a life where I could breathe, and still, there were moments where I had to remind myself, this isn't borrowed time. This is mine. One evening, I got a letter, not email, not a text, a handwritten letter, no return address, no signature. But I recognized the handwriting instantly. "Mark, I hope you're satisfied. I lost everything because of you. You could have let it go. We could have figured something out. You didn't have to ruin me. I never thought you'd really fight back. I never knew you could." I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and labeled it irrelevant. Then I burned it in the fireplace. Daniel watched the edges curl. "Was that important?" he asked. "Not anymore," I said. Later that night, I sat at my desk and began writing. Not legal filings. Not affidavits. Stories. About mothers who built legacies. About daughters who fought for truth. About silence that became steel. Because the one thing that betrayal teaches you if you survive, it is that pain is information. And when you stop letting it define you, you can start using it to shape something better. I submitted the first piece to a mid-sized journal. Nothing flashy. Just real words. Honest and sharp. They accepted it. And just like that, a new door opened. One I never expected. Each essay I wrote peeled back another layer. Not of shame, but of strength. The story that began in a courtroom didn't end there. It kept moving, like the lake under the ice. Quiet but alive. People started reaching out, wanting to share their own stories, asking how to protect themselves, how to speak when no one listens. So I started offering workshops, online at first, then in person, free sessions in libraries, women's shelters, community centers. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was helping others secure theirs. The name Allison Hale started showing up in articles, podcasts, legal blogs, not as a victim, as a survivor who changed the game. One lawyer even called me a blueprint. And yet, through it all, I never lost what mattered. Daniel thrived. He laughed more. He asked less about why we don't see those people anymore. He stopped needing to sleep with the light on, and I stopped checking over my shoulder because no one was coming anymore. They'd lost their power. The day I stopped playing their game, and every day since. I'd been writing new rules. We returned to the city only when we had 2 school conferences, grocery runs, doctor's appointments, otherwise. The cabin was our center. Our future. One evening, Daniel stood on the dock, skipping stones across the frozen surface. "I bet it'll melt soon," he said. "Everything does," I told him. "But Some things come back stronger. He looked up at me, like he understood exactly what I meant. The spring thaw came slowly. Patches of snow receded from the tree roots. The lake cracked, then shifted, then rippled like a breath held too long, finally let go. And just like that, life resumed. Daniel started at a new school in town. Smaller, no whispers, no sideways glances from staff who once took Lorraine's word over mine. Here, he was just Daniel Hellbright, curious, obsessed with science, and always asking if he could build a robot. I filled out the school forms with a steady hand. Custodial parent, Allison Hale. No caveats. No shared custody. No legal gray zones. Just the truth finally recognized. That truth gave me a freedom I hadn't tasted in years. I expanded the foundation. What began as a handful of online workshops turned into something tangible. The Hale Initiative, a nonprofit offering legal education and support for survivors of inheritance, fraud, and domestic financial abuse. We weren't loud, we were accurate. We hired retired notaries, volunteer paralegals, trauma-informed case managers. Each woman I brought in had been through it, and every single one brought fire with her. Our motto was simple: protect the truth, preserve the will. And the first time we overturned a fraudulent probate case for a single mother in Kansas, I cried in my car, not out of sadness, out of victory. Word traveled. We received small grants, then larger ones. Lawyers started referring impossible cases to us. Try the Hale girls. They'd say, we weren't girls, we were survivors with teeth. Meanwhile, Mark resurfaced sort of. Grace forwarded me a civil case he'd filed against a bank that froze his assets. The complaint read like a tantrum heap, blamed malicious interference, character defamation, and an ex-wife with too much time on her hands. The judge tossed it out in less than 10 minutes. Grace laughed over the phone. He still thinks he's a victim. He's not. I said, here's a consequence. The court also ruled him liable for over $92,000 in legal fees between forged documents, stolen property, and procedural delays. Lorraine was fined separately, but it barely mattered. She filed for bankruptcy within a month. I never responded. To either of them, they became shadows. Noise I no longer heard. I sold the Florida property, took the profits, and split them half into Daniel's college fund, half into the Hale Initiative. The cabin? I kept it. Always would. It was more than a home. It was where the truth had survived. One weekend, Daniel invited a friend over, his first sleepover since everything. They played on the dock, caught frogs, roasted marshmallows, and I sat on the porch, watching, realizing I hadn't felt this still in a decade. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I walked to the edge of the lake. The moon reflected on the water like silver thread. I stood barefoot, feeling the earth, breathing in peace that hadn't come from revenge but from rebuilding. And then I said something I hadn't said in years, out loud, to the dark. I forgive you. Not to Mark, not to Lorraine, to myself, for the years I didn't know how to fight, for believing their version of the truth, for waiting so long to reclaim my voice. The wind shifted slightly, like an answer. I turned back to the cabin, warm light glowing in the windows. We were home. Not just in place, in power. Summer came with long days and golden light, and for the first time in years, I let myself be. Still, no deadlines. No court dates. No fear of who might call or knock. Just a woman in a rocking chair on a cabin porch, watching her son build forts in the woods with sticks and imagination. But even peace, once earned, can feel like a question. What now? I didn't want to go back to the city. I didn't want to climb some corporate ladder or pretend I'd forgotten the war I'd just survived. And I didn't have to. The Hale Initiative was growing faster than I expected. We had over a dozen active cases and a waiting list of families needing help. I hired a case coordinator, a former public defender who specialized in elder abuse. She had a voice like gravel and a heart that could punch through stone. We started hosting monthly webinars. I gave talks, told my story, not with bitterness, but with precision. I didn't soften the betrayal, but I didn't let it own me either. The first time a survivor cried during our Q&A saying, I thought I was crazy until I heard you, I realized this was bigger than just me. It always had been. But it wasn't all legal filings and structured healing. Some nights, I'd wake from dreams, vivid ones. Mark slamming doors. Lorraine whispering behind my back. My mother watching silently from a hospital bed, unable to speak. In those moments, I'd sit on the edge of the bed, stare at the moon through the window, and breathe. I didn't chase the pain away. I let it visit. And then I let it leave. Because that's what healing is. Not the absence of memory, but but the ability to live beside it without losing yourself. Daniel began asking questions. More detailed now. Why did Dad do that? Why did Aunt Lorraine lie? And I answered carefully, not with venom, with truth. Because some people mistake silence for weakness, and some people think love means ownership. He nodded like he understood, like the seeds of emotional intelligence were already taking root. He didn't need revenge, he needed clarity. And so did I. One morning, I found a letter in our mailbox at the cabin. No return address again, but this time, the handwriting wasn't Mark's. It was Kayla's inside. A check. $2,000 and a note. I didn't know everything. I know that sounds weak, but I really didn't. I thought he was protecting you. Then I thought he was protecting me. Turns out, he was protecting himself. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I stared at it for a long time. The old me might have torn it up, but now I saw it for what it was. A woman crawling out of her own fog. I didn't cash the check. I wrote back instead. Use the money to go to therapy. Then pay it forward. That's how we heal now. I never heard back. But that wasn't the point. The point was, I had nothing left to prove. The world didn't need me to scream. It needed me to hold the line. And every day I woke up, poured coffee, opened another case file. I was doing just that. Protecting the truth. Preserving the will, and building a legacy they couldn't touch. By fall, the trees around the cabin turned amber and gold, and something in me shifted to Dot. Not a dramatic change, just a subtle recalibration. I no longer lived like I was recovering. I lived like I had arrived. The Hale Initiative held its first in-person summit that October, a modest rented conference room, 40 chairs, all filled. Survivors, lawyers, social workers. Some flew in from other states. Some drove hours just to sit in a room where their stories weren't dismissed. I opened the event, no PowerPoint. Long introduction, just my story. Stripped to its bones. I was erased on paper, but I didn't disappear. I didn't just come back, I rewrote the ending. They sat in silence, and then the applause came not loud, but fierce. Like every clap was an exhale someone had been holding too long. Later, a woman named Trina approached me. Late 50s, former nurse. She wore her grief like a scarf, wrapped tight around her shoulders. My brother did the same thing. She whispered, he forged our dad's signature. Sold the farm before we even buried him. I placed a hand on hers. We'll help you, I said. She cried. Not for the first time. But maybe the first time someone told her it was okay to cry and fight at the same time. That night, after the summit, I sat in my hotel room staring out at the city skyline. It had once felt so big, so full of power, I didn't have. Now it was just buildings. They didn't intimidate me anymore. A week later, I was invited to speak at a university law clinic. The topic, financial abuse and familial fraud in probate law. I stood before a room full of future lawyers and told them, laws don't protect people. People protect people with laws as tools. They took notes, asked questions. Some followed up later, asking to intern with us. I was building something that would last. And Daniel, he was thriving. He won his science fair, made new friends, started writing stories, funny ones, with robots and aliens and time travel. One day, I found a drawing on the fridge, me in a cape, holding a gavel, standing on a mountain. He'd written under it, my mom doesn't yell, she wins. I stared at it for a long time. Not because it made me proud, but because it was true. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't begged, I'd held the line, and every time they tried to erase me, I pressed back harder. Lorraine never resurfaced. Mark moved to Arizona. According to Grace, he changed his last name. Opened a small business, failed within 3 months. He could run from the judgment, from his past, from the woman who exposed him, but he couldn't outrun the facts. And that's what gave me peace. Not that I'd destroyed him, but that I didn't need to anymore. I'd taken back what was mine. I'd made the truth louder than the lie. And now I was living the life they tried to steal. In the stillness. In the legacy. In every quiet, honest day that followed. The first storm of winter came early. Heavy snow blanketed the lake before December, and the cabin roof creaked under the weight of it. Daniel watched flakes swirl through the window like it was the first time he'd ever seen snow. We made hot cocoa, lit the fireplace, and built a blanket fort in the living room. He insisted we sleep in it that night, me on one side, him on the other. Flashlights casting shadows across the ceiling, as he fell asleep. I stared at the beams above and thought about the things that used to keep me up at night. Now, I slept. When I awoke, my inbox held a new message. From a name I hadn't seen in over a year, Susan Lin, investigative journalist. She'd read the article. Camille had written about my case and wanted to feature the Hale Initiative in a series on estate fraud and legal abuse. National coverage, syndicated. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I wrote, we're ready. 2 weeks later, she and her crew arrived at the cabin. Lights, cameras, microphones, the whole thing. Daniel was at school. I wore a soft blue sweater, the one my mom gave me 2 Christmases before she passed. They filmed me walking the dock, flipping through legal documents, sitting by the fire with Grace. Susan asked thoughtful questions. But at one point, she paused, voice softer. What was the moment you knew you'd already won? I thought for a long second. It wasn't the ruling. I said, it was the morning I made pancakes without checking my phone for threats. She blinked, then smiled. That's going in the final cut. The segment aired in January, over 3 million views in a week. Our website crashed from the traffic. We received over 700 email stories, support, donations, volunteer offers, survivors who saw themselves in my voice, strangers who no longer felt invisible. And with it came scrutiny. One podcast tried to discredit me, bringing on a family friend of Mark's who claimed I'd exaggerated for fame, said I'd always been a little cold. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Our legal filings were public record, and silence, again, was my sharpest tool. Daniel came home from school holding a clipping. Mom, he said, holding it out. You're in the library newsletter. I took it, read the bold headline. Single mom turns legal tragedy into national movement. Underneath, a photo of me at the summit, eyes calm, mouth unflinching. It hit me in that moment. This was legacy, not the land, not the money, but the change. The example I left behind. That night, I sat at the cabin window, snow falling gently outside, and wrote something in my journal. They buried the truth. I dug it up. They tried to break me. I became unshakable. They erased my name. I carved it into stone because I hadn't just reclaimed my mother's will. I'd rewritten mine. And now I lived by it, line by line. We held the second Hale Initiative Summit in Chicago, this time in a university auditorium. 300 attendees, 12 states represented, 15 active attorneys, 10 volunteers for keynote speakers. We didn't just fill the room, we changed it. This year, the theme was Inheritance is More Than Money, because we'd learned something critical over the past year. What families steal isn't always cash, sometimes it's identity, voice, trust, the right to remember someone honestly. I opened the event with a story, not mine, but my mother's. I told them about the woman who packed sandwiches in wax paper, who left handwritten notes in my lunchbox until I was in high school, who kept every rental agreement and utility bill neatly filed by decade. She never missed a payment, I said, but she missed the moment they turned her into a loophole. The audience leaned forward. I told them how my mother trusted the law to do its job until it didn't. How that trust was used against her in the final weeks. How silence allowed it. How strategy reversed it. And when I finished, I told them the most important part. This isn't a cautionary tale. It's a blueprint. Then Grace took the stage and walked them through practical protections. How to build a trust, how to record a will properly, how to spot a forged signature, how to choose witnesses who won't fold under pressure. We weren't just telling stories anymore. We were building a defense. After the summit, I stood outside as the snow fell again, soft, quiet, almost ceremonial. A woman approached me, mid-30s, tired eyes, strong voice. My brother forged our dad's will, she said. I haven't seen my nephews since the funeral. But after today, I'm going home to file. I just wanted you to know your story gave me permission. I nodded, too moved to speak. Because that, more than the court rulings, the article, the national spotlight, that was the win. Giving someone else the courage to act. Back at the cabin, Daniel and I painted the dock together. The old boards had worn gray over time, splintered by storms and sun. He picked deep forest green. Why not blue? I asked. He shrugged. Green is stronger. I smiled. You're not wrong. That weekend, we invited 2 families from the initiative to the cabin, single moms, both survivors of similar fraud, both still navigating custody hearings. We grilled on the porch, let the kids build snowmen, and at night, sat around the fire swapping stories. Not war stories. Survivor stories. Stories where the woman doesn't break. She comes back. Stories where silence is chosen, not forced. where the courtroom is a battlefield, but the home is the prize. And in those flickers of firelight, I saw a future where this didn't happen to other women. Because we had turned the lie into a map, and we were handing it out freely. The subpoena landed on my desk in late March. Mark was trying again. This time, he'd filed a civil complaint in a different state, claiming undue influence, emotional sabotage, and most absurdly intentional alienation from his biological child. He was suing me for defamation, financial harm, and parental interference. That it would have been funny if it weren't so calculated. He filed in a state where I had no residence, hoping I'd be forced to spend money to respond, to travel, to play defense again. I forwarded the complaint to Grace. She read it, then called me while walking her dog. Frivolous. We'll file a motion to dismiss based on lack of jurisdiction. He's throwing darts in the dark now. I sighed. Do I have to appear? No, I've got it. Still, the paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't fear, it was fatigue. But I reminded myself, this is what predators do when they lose control. They lash out in legal loops. They think they can exhaust you into silence. That night, I didn't tell Daniel. He was curled up on the couch reading a book about stars. His world was calm. I wouldn't let Mark crack it. Instead, I took a long shower, stood in the steam, and reminded myself, I've been through worse. I've already won. Grace filed the dismissal within 24 hours. Attached exhibits, cited prior judgments. Called it what it was. Retaliatory litigation. The judge threw it out in 5 days. No hearing. No chance to revise. Mark's last play burned. Out before it even hit the board. I didn't tell anyone. Not the initiative team, not the board, not my friends. I just slid the document into my final folder and moved on, because that's what healing looks like when it's real, not reacting. And the more I lived like that, the quieter the world around me became. A week later, Daniel came home with a school project. Build a model of your family tree. I braced myself, but he opened his poster board and began drawing. My mom at the top, me next, then him. Off to the side, a tree stump labeled roots cut off. He didn't add any names. You okay with this? He asked, glancing up. I nodded. It's honest. He smiled. I like our tree better. We glued photos to the board, him and me at the lake, me and my mom baking cookies, us holding a case-closed folder with huge grins. It was the most powerful document I'd seen all year. That weekend, I cleaned out the last drawer in my office, the one that held old receipts, broken pens, and a crumpled birthday card from a time when I still believed Mark could change. I threw it all out. Then I lit a fire in the hearth, poured a glass of wine, and sat down with Daniel as he read aloud from his favorite book, Peace Isn't the Absence of Conflict, It's the Refusal to Return to War Once You've Won. And I had won. Not just in court. In life, the day the probate court officially closed the estate, I didn't tell anyone, no ceremony, no announcement. Just a notification from the clerk's office, marked, final distribution confirmed. Case closed. I stared at it for a long moment. The last page in a file that once defined my every breath. Then I printed it, not to frame it, to file. Etunder completed, because it wasn't who I was anymore. Just proof of who I had become. The Hale Initiative was now operating in 4 states. We'd helped over 100 families reclaim stolen estates or secure protective orders. We weren't just a nonprofit anymore, we were a movement. A senator's office even reached out, requesting input on a bill proposal targeting elder abuse in inheritance law. When Grace forwarded the invite, I read it 3 times before responding. Tell them I'll come, I wrote, but I won't water anything down. The hearing was held in D.C. I flew out alone, walked into the chamber wearing a dark blue blazer and my mother's wedding ring on a chain around my neck. When it was my turn, I stood before the panel and said, my mother didn't lose her estate. It was stolen through manipulation, forged documents, and silence. And it would have worked if I had stayed quiet. I outlined how isolated probate law is abused, how few safeguards exist, and how many families are dismantled behind closed doors. I'm not here to beg for policy, I finished. I'm here to remind you that truth without protection is just another thing people bury. Afterward, 2 staffers approached me privately, asking to collaborate. We were being heard, truly heard, that night. I walked alone through the city, letting the wind carry away the years of exhaustion. I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was helping design it. Back at the cabin, Daniel greeted me with a card. It said, "To the woman who made paper beat power." I laughed. It was a reference to the way I used to describe court filings. Paper cuts deeper than lies. I'd once told him. He never forgot. We tacked the card to the cabin wall next to the firewood. Racked at it hung there like a flag a few days. Later, I received a certified letter from the state of Arizona. Mark had filed for personal bankruptcy. He listed liabilities far exceeding assets. And under creditor disputes, he named me. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to fight, for he was officially, publicly, and legally bankrupt, not just financially, but the damage he tried to inflict had circled back. And I didn't need revenge. I had outcome. I had proof. I had peace. I closed the letter, filed it under no further action, and got back to my day planning next month's summit, editing a legal resource guide, and helping a new mother in Oregon prepare to contest a falsified trust. This was my life now, and every second of it was earned by spring. The cabin had become more than a home, it was a headquarters. A small team from the initiative moved into the nearby town. We converted the old boathouse into a lakeside office. Quiet, efficient, fortified with Wi-Fi and whiteboards and coffee that never ran out. Grace made monthly visits now. She joked that she liked the quiet here more than her downtown condo. Sometimes she stayed in the guest room and helped Daniel with his math homework between court filings. We'd become a family, one built by truth, not blood. That May, I gave a TEDx talk. The title, Inheritance Isn't Just About Wealth, It's About Memory. I stepped on stage in a dark dress, no notes, no teleprompter, just my voice. I told them how betrayal rewrites the story of someone's life, how fraud doesn't just steal assets, it poisons legacy, and how the antidote isn't vengeance, it's exposure. Afterward, a young woman came up to me shaking. My stepfather forged my mother's will, she whispered. He said no one would believe me. But now, I do. I held her hand. That night, I sat on the cabin porch, wine in hand, phone silent. The lake shimmered like liquid glass. Daniel came out in his pajamas and curled up beside me. Are you famous now? He asked. No, I said. I'm just loud enough to be heard. He grinned, then went back inside. The next morning, I found something unexpected. A handwritten envelope in the P.O. box again. But this time, it was from Mark's mother. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the divorce. She'd chosen him, always. Did inside the envelope, a short note. Allison, you were right. I didn't want to believe it, but I see it now. He used me too. I'm sorry. I hope someday Daniel knows I wasn't part of what happened. Margaret Hastings' eyes sat with the letter for a long time. Not angry, not moved, just aware of how many people had clung to the illusion. Even as the house collapsed, I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. Truth, once revealed, doesn't need a stage. It just needs witnesses. Back at the cabin, Daniel and I spent the afternoon painting the guest room. He picked a light teal color, called it Ocean Breeze. As we rolled paint over old plaster, he said, "Do you think Grandma would like it?" I looked around. At the light, at the calm, she'd love it. Because the war was long over. But the legacy, that was still growing. The third anniversary of my mother's passing came quietly. No flowers on the grave. No public post, just Daniel and me, standing beneath a blooming dogwood at the cemetery. Wind curling through our jackets. He placed a drawing. At her headstone, a picture of the cabin, the dock, and a small figure fishing in the lake. I think she'd want to fish with us, he whispered. She already does, I said, touching his shoulder. We stood there a little longer in silence. No tears, just memory. Afterward, we drove home, windows down, the radio playing softly. Life had folded into something calm, not simple, never that, but earned. That evening, as I was closing out a case report for a client in Maine, an alert popped up on my laptop. Civil litigation, Hastings v. Hale dismissed with prejudice. The Arizona court had officially barred Mark from ever refiling. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. There it was. Final. The end of all legal ties. No appeals. No more filings. Nothing left to untangle. I looked around the cabin. Light from the fireplace flickered against the walls. Daniel's laughter echoed from the loft where he was building another of his Lego masterpieces. And I felt it finally and fully peace, not just survival, not just rebuilding. Peace. A few days later, we hosted our biggest initiative fundraiser yet, held at a historic estate once almost lost in a probate scam. Fitting. We raised over $300,000 that night. One of the speakers, a young woman named Janelle, told her story how she was written out of her grandmother's will by an estranged uncle who manipulated documents. She fought back using one of our free legal kits. She won. She stood tall on that stage and said, Allison Hale's story saved mine. I didn't cry, but something deep in me cracked and softened. After the event, I walked out alone, heels clicking softly on the cobblestone. Grace caught up to me. "You're changing the system." She said no. I replied, "I'm teaching women how to never need it." She smiled. Same thing. That weekend, I finally did what I'd been putting off for months. I drove back to the city. To the housemark, and I once owned. It had been foreclosed. Boarded up, weeds grew in the driveway, graffiti scarred the garage. I parked across the street and just watched. Not with regret, not with nostalgia. But with recognition. That's where I used to live, in his world, in his control, in his silence. And now I had land that was mine, a legacy that mattered, and a voice that didn't stutter anymore. I took a photo of the house. Not to remember him. To remind myself of what I'll never return to. Then I drove away. Daniel was waiting at the cabin, holding 2 fishing poles. "I saved you the good one," he said, and I believed him. Spring melted into summer again, and the lake settled into its familiar rhythm. Dragonflies skipping across the surface, wind rustling through the pines, the sound of Daniel's laughter drifting across the water like music. This time last year, I was filing motions. This year, I was planting tomatoes. The initiative was thriving. We'd expanded into legal partnerships with 3 more states. 2 new grants had come in. A publishing house reached out about turning my story into a memoir. I told them maybe. I wasn't sure yet if the world deserved my full story. Not unless they promised to print it exactly how it happened. Cold, sharp, unflinching. No soft filters. No redemption arcs for those who never asked for forgiveness. One afternoon, while I was pruning the wild lilacs behind the cabin, a rusted-out sedan pulled up to the gate. My shoulders tensed. I dried my hands on my jeans and walked slowly toward it. A man stepped out. Not Mark, but someone close. His brother, Paul. We hadn't spoken in over 5 years. He looked older, tired, like he'd been carrying someone else's shame. "I won't stay long," he said, holding up both hands. "You're already here," I replied. "Cool." He nodded. I needed to see it for myself." "The place you fought for." I said nothing. He looked around at the cabin, the garden, the wind chimes swaying above the porch. I read the article, the ruling. I didn't know half of it, Allison. I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't ask." He swallowed. "You're right." A long silence. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. "This was your mom's. My mom had it tucked away in a drawer. I think it was supposed to be yours." I opened the box. Inside, a simple silver locket. My name. Engraved on the back, a photo of me and my mother on the inside, a photo I thought had been lost years ago. For the first time in a long time, my breath caught. "She always loved you," he said, voice low. "I think she tried to protect you, even when we failed her." I nodded. "I know." He turned to go. "I won't bother you again." "You didn't bother me," I said. "But next time, don't wait until everything is ruined." He nodded and drove away, the sound of tires crunching gravel fading into the trees. I held the locket in my hand for a long time, not because it changed anything, but because it didn't have to. Some things survive without anyone knowing they were hidden. That evening, I stood at the end of the dock while Daniel fished beside me. The sky was soft orange, the lake glowing. "Mom," he said, without looking up. "Yeah, do you think people ever stop lying?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said, "but some of us stop listening." He smiled. That night, I hung the locket beside my mother's old recipe card, framed above the hearth. The past hadn't vanished. It had just been sorted, filed, closed, and what remained? Me, my son, the truth, and a quiet that finally felt like home. There's a silence that comes after war, not peace, not yet, just space. The absence of threat. The moment where your breath doesn't catch when the phone rings. The morning you make coffee and realize you don't have to explain yourself to anyone anymore. That's where I live now, for years. They made me doubt what I saw, what I knew. They made me question if memory could stand up to paper, if grief could be weaponized. And I learned the hard way, yes, it can. But I also learned how to fight back, not with rage, not with noise, with facts, with ink, with the cold, relentless truth. I was erased from a document, and they thought that meant I'd be erased from history. They didn't expect me to rebuild it, to find the real will, to change everything. And I did. They taught me what silence could do, so I weaponized it. They buried the truth. I exhumed it. They forged a story. I burned the pages and rewrote it in my name. I don't need apologies. I don't need them to understand. I have my son. I have my mother's legacy preserved protected, alive in the cabin where she once taught me how to be still. And I have myself. Not the version they tolerated, the version they couldn't silence. So, if you're reading this, if you've been made small, rewritten, or dismissed, let me say what they never will. You are not too late, you are not too quiet, and you are not crazy. Pick up the pen, sign your name, seal the page, and when they finally read it, make sure it ends with a line like mine. I didn't scream. I won.